So for the benefit of you who are going to see this on video, I have to apologize for the shades. I had eye surgery a little while ago, and I have to protect it against ultraviolet radiation for a period of 4 weeks because it's going to need 4 post-surgical adjustments, and UV light would mess the shape of the lens. So in the meantime, I was intending to buy a hat and a saxophone. But the community told me I needed to buy a motorbike and a leather jacket. Okay. Right. So in the meantime, let's get on with the Mass. Today is the first Sunday in Lent, and I've chosen a reading from Matthew's Gospel. It's the story of the temptation of Jesus in the wilderness. Then Jesus was led by the Spirit into the wilderness to be tempted by the devil. And after fasting 40 days and 40 nights, he was hungry. Then the tempter came and said to him, "If you are the Son of God, command these stones to become loaves of bread." But Jesus answered, "It is written, people shall not live by bread alone, but by every word that comes from the mouth of God." Then the devil took him to the holy city and set him on the pinnacle of the temple and said to him, "If you are the Son of God, throw yourself down, because it is written, he will command his angels concerning you, and on their hands they will bear you up, lest you strike your foot against a stone." Jesus replied, "Again it is written, you shall not put the Lord your God to the test." Once more, the devil took him to a very high mountain and showed him all the kingdoms of the world and their glory. And he said to him, "All these I will give to you, if you will fall down and worship me." Then Jesus said to him, "Begone, Satan, for it is written, you shall worship the Lord your God, and him only shall you serve." Then the devil left him, and behold, angels came and were ministering to him. Words inspired by God. In 1906, an Italian economist called Alfredo Pareto discovered that 80% of the land of Italy belonged to 20% of the population of Italy. And he got fascinated by this ratio, and he began to see this ratio in a whole bunch of other places. So he was an avid gardener, and he discovered, for instance, that 80% of the peas in his garden came from 20% of the pea plants in his garden. And he created what's since been known as the Pareto Principle, which says basically that 80% of the results in a system are created by 20% of the causes in the system. I'll give you just a few random examples. So in any organization, it's well established now, the 80-20 rule, that 80% of the work will be done by 20% of the people. And in sales, it's obvious that 80% of the profits come from 20% of the products, and 80% of the complaints come from 20% of the buyers. And you can take it to other areas. For instance, in soccer, 80% of the goals scored in soccer are scored by 20% of the players. Or music, 80% of the top hits in music are created by 20% of the artists in music. And even in our solar system, you look at the mass of the solar system, take the sun out of the equation and look at the planets, 80% of the mass of the solar system is contained in 20% of the planets of the system. And actually in world economics at this stage, it's been established that 82.7% of the world's resources are owned by 20% of the world's population. So this 80-20 rule seems to hold, this Pareto principle seems to hold right across. It seems almost as if it's a principle or a law of nature. And I'm going to use that, I'm picking this out because I'm going to use that continually in the course of the homily this morning. So in this morning's homily, I want to talk about the temptation to power. And I'm going to make 4 main points, basically. Firstly, I'm going to talk about Jesus' temptation to power. Then I'm going to look, secondly, at power plays throughout history. Then I'm going to look at the future of power. And then finally, Eucharist as a template of real power. So they're the 4 points I'll make this morning. So firstly, when you look at the Jesus story that we've just read here, this story of Jesus' temptation is found in all 3 synoptics, Mark, Matthew, and Luke. Now, Mark is the first of the Gospels written. It was written about 70 AD. Matthew was written about 80 AD. Luke about 90 AD. And John about 100 AD. So Mark is actually the first one written. And Mark talks about this temptation of Jesus, and he brushes it off in just two verses. He says, Jesus went into the temple, went into the desert, and he was tempted by the devil. End of story. Let's get on with it. That's pretty much it. He doesn't even tell us what the temptations were. So Matthew picks up 10 years later, and he expands it, and then Luke repeats it. And the only difference between Matthew and Luke's version is that they reverse the order of the temptations. Number 3 and 2 are flipped in these accounts. So the one I want to focus on this morning of the 3 temptations, the first one was to make bread out of stones. The second one was to throw himself off the temple in a huge show that would make it very easy for him to start a new religion. And the third one was Satan took him to the top of a great, great, great mountain so that he could see all the kingdoms of the earth. Now, I don't know if Matthew was a flat earther, that he believed that Jesus could see all the kingdoms from the top of a mountain, would be a really high mountain. Or maybe he was using, Google Maps or something. But he gave Jesus an idea of, here are all the kingdoms of the world, and here are all the resources, and they're mine to bestow on whomsoever I will. And I'll give them to you if just you'll bow down and worship me. And we heard what the result was. Now, on the face of it, this seems like a really, really dumb thing to say to Jesus. As if Jesus was going to say, oh yeah, bring it on, bring it on. He must have known that Jesus wasn't into personal power. But it's a much subtler temptation. He wasn't saying to Jesus, you can be the greatest figure in world history. You'll be in charge of everything. What he was saying to Jesus, look around you. Look at all the poverty. Look at all the regimes which are oppressive. You can take charge of every institution in the world, every organization, every kingdom, every empire, every religion, economic models, school systems, housing projects, whatever. You can take charge of all of those and then use your compassion and your wisdom to make sure that they're equally distributed among everybody. That's the temptation. But Jesus realized you can't legislate or browbeat or force people into moral behavior or into compassionate living. So he said, no thanks, but no thanks. But it's a real temptation. And it's a temptation that very, very many people, from the Sumerians in 3800 BC right down to Wall Street in 2020, were very, very happy to be seduced by. And so that's what I want to continue. I want to look at some of these then in my second point. I want to do a very, very quick review of world history and examine how this temptation to power is seen in various different governmental and economic models. So that's the second point I'll make. About 3800 BCE was the great agricultural revolution. Now, horticulture had been discovered about 9,000 years before that. Horticulture is just using the digging stick. So instead of being just hunter-gatherers taking food wherever we found it, we began to actually cultivate crops using a little digging stick, what we call in Kenya a djembe. And that went on for about 9,000 years. And then about 3,800 was the discovery of agriculture per se, the ox-drawn plough. And now we could mass produce food. Moreover, at the same period of time, we discovered or we invented glazed pottery, which allowed us to store grain so that it wasn't spoiled by water, or rodents couldn't get into it, so we could stockpile great treasure troves of food, mass produce it, and stock it. And life changed radically on planet Earth when that happened. Now people had the leisure time. This is when we invented philosophy, science, mathematics, geometry, astronomy, orthographies, literature, all these religions even, legal systems, all these came into being at this stage. But it created a huge divide because like everything else that human beings either discover or invent, we weaponize everything. We've weaponized food, we've weaponized fire, we've weaponized finances, we've weaponized cars and boats and planes and even religions. Everything we discover, everything we invent, we manage somehow to weaponize it. So food got weaponized really, really quickly. So you could destroy an enemy by simply burning his food stock. Or you could steal it and bring it with you, because we also had the wheel at this stage, so we could steal masses of stuff and take it back to our own place. So at this stage, you get the first kind of kingdom. So the first kind of rulership that kind of succumbed to the temptation of power, I believe, would be monarchy or empire, where single individuals and eventually families through those bloodlines took charge of entire cultures and entire peoples. They took all of the resources, particularly the food, and they dished it out to people who were subservient to them. So you established this monarchical system, which lasted right down to the 19th century. So it's this system where you grabbed all the resources and parceled out slowly, slowly. So the first great grab of resources and the first abuse of power came through the monarchy. And the monarchy existed, as I say, right down to our own times. Now, some of these models were contemporaneous with each other. So the second great effort that succumbed to the power of temptation, I'm going to call it theocracy. And theocracy is a system where alleged scriptures or divine revelation become the law of the land, where there's no difference. The code of human behavior and the code of religious worship are identical documents, and people have to worship both. So treason, and breaking the law of God are the same thing, in fact. And I'm just going to pick 3 examples of theocracies throughout the ages. And the first one I pick would be Israel, from about 1000 BC right down to the Roman conquest, 70 AD, the destruction of Jerusalem in 70 AD. During that period of time, their code of conduct is Torah, allegedly the 613 precepts handed down by God to Moses on Mount Sinai. And they clove to those belief systems really, really strongly, even when they were kind of beaten up and occupied by various empires. And so the empires had existed since monarchy, starting off with the Sumerians, 3800 BC, and then the Akkadians after them, and then the Assyrians after that, and then the Babylonians after that, and then the Egyptians, and then the Persians, and then the Greeks, and then the Romans, and then the Spaniards, and then the Portuguese, and then the British finally. So it was one monarchy succeeding the other in grabbing the world's resources. Now, with theocracy, they're kind of in bed together. But the people who are calling the shots at this stage is the priesthood. So the people who have the code, and the Jewish code of 613 precepts was really barbaric. I mean, there's some beautiful stuff in it, but it accounted for the flood that wiped out most of the world population and genocide on a regular basis. And there are several areas where the penalty for a sin is the death penalty, either by choking, decapitation, strangulation, drowning, or by fire. And so this code became the code of the land and allegedly God's revealed word. So that's a theocracy in action. That died out pretty much with the occupation and destruction of Jerusalem in 70 AD. Christianity took it up. So for the first 300 years of its existence, Christianity was a religion, and it was a persecuted religion for a lot of that time. And then in the year 312 AD, the Emperor Constantine had a vision of a cross in the sky, and he allowed Christianity to be a religion of Rome. And when Rome was sacked in 461 AD, and the emperor then moved to Constantinople, moved eastward, the Christian church became the controller of the empire, the old Roman Empire. So it very, very quickly became a theocracy. That which had just been a religion concerned with the afterlife and good living now began to manage the Roman Empire. And the title shifts then. When you study history, it goes from Christianity to Christendom, as in kingdom. And so now, for a period of about 1,000 years, the popes and the clergy controlled secular and sacred life, particularly in Europe. And the results, like all power grabs, all power temptations, crusades against the outsiders where we murdered people in their tens of thousands, and then inquisitions against the insiders where you murdered people in their tens of thousands within the group. And not only did Christendom claim to have secular and sacred power, it claimed also had power in the afterlife. They could determine where you wound up for all eternity. And so for missing Mass on a Sunday or eating sausage on a Friday, they could send you to hell for all eternity. So that was theocracy in action in Christendom. Islam is a third great one. And again, Islam is a code based on the Quran in which secular law and sacred law are identical. It's called the Sharia. And throughout history, and even in modern times, there are some really barbaric elements to Sharia. For instance, public executions, decapitating people for adultery, cutting people's hands off for stealing. Women have very few rights in many of these Islamic countries were based on Sharia, and very, very often other religions are not allowed to be practiced. So it's probably the last surviving form of theocracy, where you have huge Muslim populations, particularly it seems in the Arab world. So that was the second movement then in controlling people and the temptation to power. The third use and temptation to power in government, it seems to me, comes with despots or dictators. And they've been sprinkled liberally throughout history. But the 20th century saw an explosion of them. So you had Stalin in Russia. You had Hitler in Germany. You had Mussolini in Italy. You had Generalissimo Franco in Spain. And you had Idi Amin in Uganda. And I lived in East Africa during Amin's reign between 71 and 79. Idi Amin came to power in a coup against the then president of Uganda, a guy called Milton Obote. And he overthrew Obote in a bloody coup and took control of the country. And after his victory, people lined the streets applauding him because Obote had been corrupt, but nothing like what was to follow. And this is something you'll see again and again throughout history, and I'll emphasize towards the end. Any revolution which is bloody and violent creates blood and violence in whoever takes over. You just replace one bloody regime often with a bloodier regime. And that's what happened in Uganda. But shortly after his victory, he's marching down the main street of Kampala, the capital of Uganda, with his generals around him. And in the meantime, he had given the Asian community, there was a big East Asian community living in Uganda, and had lived there for generations and generations. And they were great business people. They ran a lot of the economy of Uganda and ran it really, really well. They made sure products were available and exports brought in money. He gave them 3 months to leave the country. No matter they were born there or their grandparents were born there, they were out after 3 months. And so they're gone. And so he's walking down the main street of Kampala with his henchmen, and he's pointing out, oh, there's a jewelry store. Who wants a jewelry store? Me, 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 me. That's yours. Oh, there's a restaurant. Who wants a restaurant? Me, me, me. There's a restaurant. Take it. You know, if there was a kind of an auto mechanic show, who wants an auto mechanic? Me, me, me. Take it. And these guys who had no interest or no ability in these areas literally just looted these places. And within 3 months, the economy of Uganda had fallen on its face. You've taken all the business friends. So this was the first evidence of Pareto's principle, that the 20% who are keeping the economy going are taken, or keeping 80% of the economy going, are gone. And now you're left with the people who've done nothing and know very little about these to run the country. There's one famous incident when a Uganda airline plane left Kampala to fly to London. And it landed in Addis Ababa in Ethiopia to refuel. And they weren't allowed to refuel because they had no credit. The Uganda government had no credit at that stage, and they had huge debts. So the plane couldn't take off. So what did they do? They organized a collection on the plane, and the passengers contributed money so they could buy aviation fluid to put in the plane to continue their journey into London. So that's how badly the whole system had collapsed on itself. Meantime, it's bad enough that the economy had collapsed. It's estimated that in his 8 year of terror, Idi Amin killed 300,000 of his own people. In fact, there's a huge big hydroelectric dam at a place called Jinja at the northern end of Lake Kisumu, which serves Kenya, Uganda, and Tanzania for electricity. The whole system broke down. And when they investigated, it was clogged with dead bodies. That's where the soldiers would dump people. 300,000 people were killed during his regime. Finally, he was overthrown, and he went and he lived out his days in Saudi Arabia. So there's an example of a despot in action. That's this kind of the next wave of the temptation to power when it goes awry. The fourth style I want to identify of governing people, and the temptation to power would be communism. And in the about less than 75 years that communism existed in Russia, it totally destroyed the country. And again and again and again you find out, countries that adopted a communistic regime, they denied human rights, there was mass surveillance, there was mass hunger, and there was execution by the hundreds of millions of their own people. Their comrades became dead comrades really quickly. And I'm going to just give 3 examples of that. The first one would be the USSR, which came into being, because of the corruption of the Tsarist regime. And so you're trying to overthrow one corrupt system, a monarchy, with another system, communism. And because it's a bloody revolution, as I keep saying, every time you overthrow a corrupt regime violently, you become violent in the process, and violence is the way you maintain your power and your control. And so they took control 1917. And particularly under the kind of teaching of Karl Marx and under the stewardship particularly of Joseph Stalin, what happened was the following. There was a group of people who were identified in the USSR called the kulaks, K-U-L-A-K. And kulaks were farmers who were successful farmers. So they were kind of better than your average farmers. Most of them had maybe more cows than another guy, or were able to hire 2 or 3 workers in their farms. So they became the enemy, because Marxist philosophy was that anybody who raises his head above the crowd obviously is corrupt and is dominating people, and they need to be hit down. So they identified the kulaks, all those successful farmers in Russia, over 2 million of them, and they were either killed or deported to Siberia, shot or deported. And as you can imagine, with Pareto's principle, these were the people who were really, really good at farming. These were the people who could produce food for the entire country. In the 1930s, the Ukraine, which was at that stage called the breadbasket of the USSR, 6 million Ukrainians died of starvation, because the government was collectivizing all the resources, taking all the food that's produced in the countryside and bringing it into the cities and dispersing it in that fashion. So this effort to kind of equalize everybody, it did. It equalized everybody in poverty, and it created a state where people are snitching on each other. Many neighbors were very, very happy to say, oh, yeah, Matthew is a kulak. You know, he's got 15 cows. I only have 5 cows. And so Matthew is the enemy. So we take out Matthew and his family and we shoot them. So we kill all the people who are really productive and are creating food for the country, and then we dispense whatever food is there, and finally the entire economy falls on its face, which is what happened under Stalinist Russia. You know, the intellectuals and the people who were trying to bring about, you know, understanding, they were either jailed or killed. A character called Alexander Solzhenitsyn wrote his very famous book then, the Gulag Archipelago, you know, which really showed out, you know, the criminal nature of the communist enterprise in the USSR. So that's one example. It fell 1991, Gorbachev signed it off, and it dissolved the USSR and that system. A second one would be Cambodia. You've all heard of the Khmer Rouge and their kind of what happened in Cambodia. Well, the architect and the genius behind that was a guy called Khieu Samvan, who was a very bright guy, and he was educated in France in the Sorbonne, and he got his PhD in the Sorbonne, which is one of the top universities in the world. And his thesis, his doctoral thesis, stated that non-farmers in Cambodia were a drain on society, and they needed to be exterminated. And only the farmers were producing. Nobody else except farmers were producing anything of value. He went back to Cambodia, and in the 1970s became kind of the de facto ideologue of communism in Cambodia. And what did he do? He shut down all the banks. He made it illegal to have any form of currency in your possession. He closed all the markets, all the businesses, and he evacuated the urban population into the rural areas to become farmers. And in the course of the next 2 decades, 1/4 of the population of Cambodia died in the fields. It's called the killing fields of Cambodia. People taken out of cities and deported into country, people who knew nothing about agriculture or being farming, and they were to produce food for the rest of the country. 1/4 of the population died. And the third example I want to give of that is something I witnessed myself. I lived in Tanzania for 3 months between September and December of 1973 when I was learning Kiswahili. Tanzania at that stage, the president of Tanzania was a man called Julius Nyerere. He was a teacher. He was given the honorific title Mwalimu, which just means teacher. It's like Brahmacharya in Sanskrit. It's an honorific title. He was called Mwalimu Nyerere, teacher Nyerere. And in fact, he was a man of great integrity himself. But he was allied to communist China. And so he was trying to create a socialist system in Tanzania. And so bureaucrats under him literally, and I kid you not, took a map of Tanzania. And they looked at the entire map and said, they with kind of mathematical precision, let's identify, I can't remember the exact numbers, I'm going to say 200. Let's identify 200 pieces on this map which are equidistant from each other. And then we'll move all the population to those 200 locations so that distribution of resources would be much, much easier. Now, they didn't look, were there rivers there, were there mountains, was there desert, what it was, that was important. It was a mathematical exercise to pinpoint places in the map which were equidistant. And I'm living there at that stage. And what happened was they literally took people out of villages that have existed for hundreds of years, and they deported them to a dot on the map. And there was nothing there. Some places it was the middle of a desert. There were no schools, there were no markets, there were no resources, there were no hospitals, no healthcare whatsoever. There weren't even roads in many of these places, and they're dumped there. And you can imagine what happened. There's a huge famine. And the world community started sending food aid to Tanzania, which arrived in Dar es Salaam and the docks in Dar es Salaam on the Indian Ocean, and lay there and rotted because they couldn't get into the interior, because there were no roads often. And moreover, the people living in Dar es Salaam, what did they care? They had food. They didn't care about the Hicks living in the bush. And so a whole bunch of people died. So that's what happens when you have a regime which pretends to be interested in equality and the equal distribution of the resources to everybody without thinking through a whole bunch of considerations, primarily among them the Pareto Principle, that if you muzzle and destroy the entrepreneurial people, people who are really, really good at some things and try to equalize it, the whole thing falls asunder. If I were to use a kind of a dumb example, it'd be like somebody buys the 49ers and thinks, yeah, we lost the Super Bowl this year. We need to do something different. Let's do this. So how many people on a football team, Ed? Is it 11? 11. So we're going to say, the 11 people on the team, we're going to have to rotate all the tasks. So everybody's going to get a chance to be the quarterback. And everybody's going to get a chance to be the wide receiver. And the big 350-pound guy in the middle of the yoke is going to be a wide receiver or a quarterback, because everybody deserves to get a chance at everything. And then see what happens to the standard of football in the 49ers. That's pretty much what these unthought-through systems look like. It sounds really, really good to distribute resources equally, and at the very end I will say how that might be done. But to think that you can just flatten the whole field and expect things to continue as usual is ridiculous. So that's what happens when you get a kind of a communistic system allied to a kind of a socialist mentality that hasn't been thought through. That will be the fourth wave. And fifthly, I want to look at democracy and capitalism. Another attempt, an attempt which in some senses succeeded very well, and in some senses is falling on its face. And so democracy was an idea first introduced by the Greeks about 350 BCE, in Athens particularly. And it was an extraordinary system. It's coming out of societies which are either theocratic or monarchical, and so it's an effort to try to equalize it in some way. But in Athens at the time, in this democracy, 1/3 of the population were slaves. So you had embedded institutionalized slavery was part of the democratic process. We were the next kind of country to kind of come up with this notion, 1776, this brilliant document, the Declaration of Independence, but there's embedded slavery in that document. The African population, are slaves. And the Native American Indian population in that document are called savages, and women won't get the right to vote for about another 140 years. So even in that document, it was a start. And in fairness, over the succeeding maybe 200 years, we've moved forward and we've evolved a little bit. So democracy, allied to capitalism, has gone places where the others didn't. But it has big deficits as well. So what are some of the deficits? So things that have been tried that fell on their faces for me was the kind of the forced, what I would call, ruralization of Cambodia, where you forcibly took people from cities who knew nothing about agriculture and brought them to the countryside. So forced ruralization doesn't work. Russia's idea of forced collectivization, socialism, did not work very, very obviously. And the downside of democracy, as I see it, and as I looked at it over the last 20 or 30 years, is what I would call forced urbanization. Not forced ruralization, but forced urbanization. And so, for instance, you take agriculture, in which farmers who've lived for generation after generation after generation on their land and who loved it and knew it and are engaged in varied kinds of crops, is now becomes agriculture, becomes agribusiness. It's taken over by these huge big corporations, and farmers are put out of business and forced into cities. And now we're going to use GMO crops and pesticides and herbicides, and everything goes into the hands of business people. And the second thing I would say was kind of I would call it the mega consolidation of our institutes. Like I grew up when I was a kid, my first education was in a schoolroom, literally one room. And there were 6 classes in the room, divided in the middle. Standard 1, 2, and 3 at one side, 4, 5, and 6 on the other. And there are 2 teachers that rotated between the 2 of them. And there's maybe 8 or 9 kids in each class. And we were taught English, Irish, history, geography, mathematics, science, literature, and we came out of it with great educations. Now we crowd kids into these huge big city schools, and the major problem is discipline and making sure kids aren't carrying knives or guns into school, and the standard of education goes down. You do the same thing with the healthcare system, and you have these re-specialized places, but healthcare in the hinterland is gone. Or you take, for instance, the typical village had a police officer, a peace officer, who was born in the village, knew everybody in the village, and everybody in the village knew him. And now you take them all into a big city, and you put them in squad cars, and you gun them. Nobody knows them. They're the enemy of the people, and the people are the enemy of the cops. And the crime goes up, education goes down. So I would call this the kind of the forced urbanization of America, and it is not working. Something is rotten in the state of Denmark with that. There's also a huge discrepancy happening because there are 2 kinds of people who are corrupting the democratic process and the capitalist model. And the first group are at the very top, and the other group are near the bottom. The group at the top is the 1%, who own an extraordinary amount. So you have to try to balance that with the Pareto Principle. You need entrepreneurs. You need people of vision, people of initiative, people of creativity. But they can't be rewarded to the extent that they become multi-billionaires while other people have nothing. And at the other end, you've got some people, and I'm not saying everybody, and I'll address this in a few moments, who just don't want to work. They don't want to contribute whatsoever, but they know how to play the system. So I remember, even in Ireland of my youth, there was a story told about workman's compensation was really big in Ireland. If you had any kind of an accident in work, you would get compensation from the government. And there's this guy, a neighbour of ours, who didn't want to work, never worked a day in his life. And he's complaining that when he did a day's work, and he injured his hand. And it goes to a court case. And the judge is sitting on the bench, and this guy's pleading his case that, he's crippled because of the work he'd been doing and needs workman's compensation. And the judge says, my poor man, what happened? I hurt my arm and my work, it's useless to me. And he said, the judge says, how high can you lift it? He says, like that, that's it. That's all I can do. And the judge says, gee, I'm really sorry. And before the accident, how could you lift it? Oh, I could put it right up there. So people play the system. And in the middle, you have the middle class cut, who are supporting both, in a sense. That's the downside of the democratic and the capitalist system, as I see it. The upside is a rising tide lifts all boats. And in my study of world history and systems, there has been no system that has done that as well as capitalism, in spite of the fact it really needs to be overhauled in some way. No other system has given more civil rights and more kind of economic independence to more of its citizens than the capitalist model. Monarchy didn't do it. Dictators didn't do it. Theocracy didn't do it. Communism didn't do it. So this has been the best effort we've created. Now, I want to see how we can move that forward in the process. That'll be my third point. I keep harping on this piece of it. Again and again and again, personally in Africa, and historically in my reading, I've seen again and again and again that when you overthrow a regime in a bloodthirsty fashion, you create violence and it's embedded in the system. I'm thinking just off the top of my head of the French Revolution, 1789, which overthrew a monarchy of 1,000 years standing. And how long did it last? Less than a decade. And Napoleon came along and made himself the emperor. And so when you overthrow a regime violently, all you do is you create violence and you just put somebody else in the place. As we move forward into a better form of democracy and a better form of capitalism, or whatever will replace capitalism, we need some kinds of guiding principles. It cannot be done violently. And by violence, I don't just necessarily mean it can't be done with a gun. It can't be done with angry thoughts. It can't be done with angry words. It can't be done out of anxiety or depression or rage of any kind. It has to be done out of love. And I'll finish my homily today by saying exactly how. So that's the first thing we need to learn. You cannot, heal corrupt systems by corrupt people going into it or trying to overthrow it. During my time in Kenya, I was involved quite a bit in water production because I lived in a semi-desert area. So I was involved in lots of projects where we tried to bring water from sources to villages. And most of them succeeded really, really, really well. But two particular projects failed. One was a system where we piped water to a village, but the pipes were faulty because somebody literally had gone along with a spear and just speared the PVC piping because his village hadn't got the project. And when we turned on the water in the village after 3 years of work, nothing came through because the whole system was leaking. That's what happens when you have faulty, corrupt systems. You cannot deliver the product to the consumer. The other project, we did it successfully and brought water to the village. What we didn't realize is that the source of the water was contaminated. So everybody in the village was down with dysentery 2 days later. So we piped the water efficiently, but the water itself was suspect. Now, they're the people. The people are the water, and the systems are the pipes. And that's why Jesus will say, new wine, new wineskins. If you want to create a brand new model, you have to change not just the system, you have to change the people that will go into the system. Because even if you've got a good system and you bring corrupt people into it, they'll destroy the system. And if you have a corrupt system and you bring good people into it, the people will get corrupted. So you need good water and you need good pipes. You need new wine, new wineskins, new kind of thinking, and new kind of personal self-transformation. There will be no change. There will be no model arriving on planet Earth unless as individuals we transform ourselves and our relationships in our families. There will be no changes at a political or a national or a global level as long as in our communities, that we're communities kind of invested in anger or fear or prejudice against other communities. And there'll be no peace globally unless as nations we adopt the same mentality of forgiveness and getting rid of prejudices. And so they have to go side by side, good water and good pipes, new wine, new wineskins, and how it needs to evolve. And I'd make the following kinds of suggestions: that whatever replaces democratic capitalism, and it's the best to date, whatever replaces or whatever kind of new version of it we replace it with, it must do the following kinds of things. The first one is it needs to protect people's freedoms. Firstly, freedom from surveillance. And that's beginning to happen in our country, a loss of privacy of any kind. Google is doing it, newspapers are doing it, drones are doing it, a loss of any kind of privacy. A loss of freedom of the press, a loss of self-expression. Even on our university campuses now, it's verboten to have particular kinds of viewpoints on particular kinds of topics. Freedom of religion. So the system must protect all those freedoms. The second thing it must do, it must be based on a meritocracy. It has to really embed the Pareto Principle in deciding who gets to be in charge of what kinds of ventures, who's qualified to be the Minister for Agriculture, who's qualified to be the Minister for Education, to make sure that we have people who are competent in their fields leading those fields, and that we're encouraging the entrepreneurial spirit, the creative, the initiative to take, to begin to lift all boats from which the rest of us benefit. And this system should be able to provide all of the basic needs to everybody. Decent housing, good education, good healthcare, access to the justice system. Everybody should have those things available to them. So that would be kind of the sine qua nons. We must also create the kinds of infrastructure that allow that to survive and to flourish. As it is right now, the infrastructure in our country is going to hell, whether it's the road system or the rail system or whatever. It's collapsing under its own weight. The fifth point I would say is that there has to be a provision for those who, through no fault of their own, are vulnerable for whatever reason, aged or the very young or the crippled in various ways. They have to be protected and provided for. And at the same time, we have to look out for what in Ireland we call the spongers, the guy who couldn't lift his hand beyond this, who finally got up to there. People who are playing the system and how to game the system, that we have to protect against that piece of it. So the way forward needs to incorporate all those kinds of elements into it. That would be my third main point. Just to add a little addendum to that, tongue-in-cheek. When I studied these 5 different modalities, and the temptation to power, what I saw was that there are particular economic models wedded to particular kind of modes of government. So, for instance, monarchies and theocracies use a feudal system of economic model. And then when you get to the dictators, they use a patronage model of bribery. people, get stuff by bribing them. When you get to a communist system, you're using a socialist model of redistribution of all the resources, unthinkingly, very, very often. And when you get to kind of the democratic and the capitalist system, it's industrialists, and lawyers who are taking over the legislative process. Now, again, about 2% of the world's population are psychopaths, sociopaths, and narcissists. That's a psychological fact. They're born that way. They're born as psychopaths, sociopaths, or narcissists. It's been my experience that when you look at these 5 different professions, sociopathy, psychopathy, and narcissism are greatly overrepresented. If you want to get a good cross-section of psychopaths, sociopaths, and narcissists, you don't have to look any further, than the monarchy, the church, dictators, communism, and our system of industrialization and legislation in this country. So something needs to change. So I want to try and end on a really kind of a positive note. I think it must be the dark glasses. I want to take the notion of Eucharist. And it's interesting that when you look through the scriptures, according to the Gospels, Jesus instituted Eucharist at the Last Supper. But in actual fact, there are many other places in the Gospel where Eucharistic banquets are taking place, except they're not called that. So there's a hidden code. Whenever you see the following 4 phrases, you know that you're in the presence of a Eucharistic encounter. And you find it, for instance, when in the desert in John chapter 6, where Jesus is feeding the 5,000 with the loaves, you find this code. You find it in John chapter 21, when the 7 fishermen, after Jesus has resurrected, are invited to a banquet at the lakeside when they've been fishing all night and caught nothing. And the code is, he took, he blessed, he broke, and he distributed. Whenever you find those 4 phrases in the scriptures, you know you're dealing with a Eucharistic encounter. I want to just examine those very, very briefly, because that is the way forward. That is the economic model, and that is the system of government, which will take us out of where we are into where we're meant to go as a human race. And that's why you and I volunteered to incarnate on planet Earth at this stage of our history, to try to move this forward as individuals, as little communities, as a nation, and as a global community. He took means you don't grab resources from any part greedily. You take it, with gratitude. Gratitude to Mother Nature, who's provided everything we wear and everything we eat and everything we breathe and the sun that shines on our faces. That everything must be taken with gratitude, not grabbed greedily. So he took it with reverence and with gratitude. The second thing is he blessed it. And this is not kind of the artificial implanting of benediction on a previously inert substance. He didn't take a piece of bread and say, hoc est denum corpus meum, and suddenly the bread became his body and blood. That's not what it's about. It's that he recognized the inherent sanctity of everything that exists. Blessing is not imparting benediction to a previously neutral substance. Blessing is the recognition of the God. As Lawrence said to us at the beginning, it's being able to say to an oak tree or a kitty cat or a lake or a mountain, namaste. The God in me recognizes and honors the God in you. That's what blessing is about. It's about recognition. It's not about any kind of ritual. Ritual is only a way to remind ourselves of the inherent blessing. And then the third place, he broke it. What does that mean? It means to form the intention of distributing, to form the intention of sharing with everybody. So it means trying to, having the mindset that what I need for my needs is sufficient, and that what I don't need, belongs to somebody else. The 15 coats that hang in my closet that I never worn aren't mine anymore. They belong to the Catholic worker's house someplace else. That what I'm not using and don't need belongs to somebody else. So the intention, to kind of share everything. And the final part then, he distributed. As we will do here symbolically, we'll distribute communion as a reminder to ourselves. And that means that you have to walk the talk. It's okay to have the intention, it's okay to have great plans, but unless you actually create the infrastructure that allows you to distribute equally, according to the needs of any population, unless you create that model and distribute that model, then the whole thing is a farce. Namaste, guys.